Hello, this is Teddy Charles, and you can see Maples in the background. And today we are going to be doing an interview review, and this interview is between Vassy Kapelos and Minister of Transportation Stephen MacKinnon in regards to the Alto high-speed rail project. Enjoy.
Let's start today with the growing divide over a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project. The proposed Alto high-speed rail project would connect Quebec City to Toronto. Travelers could, for example, make it from Toronto to Montreal in just over 3 hours. For more on this, I'm joined by Government House Leader and Minister of Transport, Steve MacKinnon. I wanted to start off on the prospect of this high-speed train going ahead. Is there any chance, based on what happens over the next number of years in this assessment, that your government says no to it, or is the mandate to make it work no matter what?
The mandate is to plan and execute on building this transformational infrastructure. We're currently in a planning period that lasts 4 years. If the Conservatives had their way, that planning process would have gone a lot longer, up to 8-10 years, or the Bloc Québécois for that matter. We want to build more quickly. We want to plan this project more quickly. Incredibly complex project, but we think we can have shovels in the ground within 4 years.
All right, some things about that comment. You referenced transformational. Well, that word has also been applied to current world leaders, and transformation is not always a good thing. Second thing is, you keep talking about your opposition. You're the party in charge. You don't need to reference your opposition. That's really bad brand strategy. Look, during the Cola Wars, Coke never mentioned Pepsi. Why? They were in charge. So showing a little bit of insecurity there. And finally, let's use some machines and not shovels. You'll find the job would actually go faster. But you know what? If shovels help the job get canceled, then I'm all for that.
I understand the impetus for building things quickly. I think the concern, as I understand it, represented by both the Bloc and the Conservatives, but also existing in many areas along this, somewhat proposed route, is that in the name of speed, you will sacrifice sort of like a duty to consult them or a duty to defer to them in some way. They are afraid, to put it plainly, that their land will be expropriated. And that fear was heightened by what was passed in the Budget Implementation Act, which essentially allows you to, Alto, to go to you if they would like to expropriate that land and bypass measures that otherwise would have been in place. Why did you have to do that?
Well, again, we need to reduce this planning phase that we're in down to 4 years. But let me be very reassuring.
Minister MacKinnon telling us to be reassured is basically like telling someone who's really panicked to calm down. I don't think in the history of the world it has ever worked.
First of all, Alto is a 60-meter wide corridor. It is a linear project, therefore it needs to go uninterrupted between the cities that you just mentioned. 60 meters is not a lot of land. We will obviously follow a lot of common sense.
The definition of oxymoron. A politician talking about common sense.
Use public right-of-way when possible, electrical, utility corridors, highways where possible. And when not possible, we'll obviously apply common sense as well. We don't want to be dividing people's properties, farms, impeding access to rural roads or anything like that. So there will be all sorts of measures. The issue that we have now is we've identified a 10-kilometer wide corridor, and some politicians, Mr. Poilievre, like to pretend that that is the amount of land that Alto is going to require. That is not the case. It is a 60-kilometer wide.
All right, not sure if that was Freudian, but I understand that he meant to say meters and not kilometers. However, this is one little interview, and you made a mistake like that. If you can't do the little things right, how are you going to do the big things right, like a multi-billion-dollar project?
A 60-meter wide, rather, corridor stretching from Quebec City to Toronto.
I understand why you're opposing what Mr. Poilievre said, but it isn't just him, right? I read a lot today and found out that there are a lot of rural municipalities, for example, some councils that have even voted in opposition of this, because though you say that you're going to use common sense, that does not assure them that that will be the case, right? You have done in this Budget Implementation Act, you have kind of put in there this thing about this project that does allow, with less impediments, you to expropriate land.
Due process continues to exist. Impact assessments, environmental impact assessments,
They've been cut in half, though. It's only one agency, not the CTA
will
as
still
well.
Be followed. Well, we are working at getting all projects, large and small in Canada, out of this cycle where it takes decades to get a project approved. Yes, we are doing that. But we're reducing this plan. And guess what? We are going to save billions of dollars by bringing forward the start of construction.
I have a better way to save even more money. Just don't do the project.
On this project. That is important. But, in terms of the Conservatives, they used to think big. Brian Mulroney used to think big. Heavens, John A. Macdonald, used to think in terms of building an intercontinental railroad.
All right, so intercontinental from one side of Canada to the other. Yeah, that united the whole country. This project is only 13% of that. So 87% of the country is not served at all, and yet they're all going to have to pay for it.
Let's talk about Peterborough. That's a perfect example. A smaller city, which will find a new vocation. So in addition to all of the amazing things that currently happen in Peterborough, the access that it will give to the outside world, to Ottawa, to Toronto, to Montreal, for residents of Peterborough. So you can imagine going to Toronto to study. You can imagine working in Ottawa. These are possibilities that are absolutely transformational and that high-speed rail can offer.
That's why these interviews are so important. Before today, I did not realize that the residents of Peterborough were trapped and had no way to escape and no access to the outside world.
I looked at the consortium that has, the private sector consortium that will essentially be in charge of or tasked with implementing this and operating it. One of the companies is what used to be SNC. People in this city have a very, very distinct memory of what SNC was a part of, another consortium that delivered an LRT that was well beyond the promised cost and encountered many, many delays.
As a resident of Ottawa, I completely agree with Vassy. The LRT has been a colossal failure. In fact, it's so bad, I am surprised that Weird Al has not made a parody of a Shaggy song describing it. There was a little bit of rain. It doesn't work. There was a little bit of snow. It doesn't work. I looked at it the wrong way. It doesn't work.
Why should we believe this time will be different?
Well, that firm is in a consortium with people like SNCF, the French TGV builder.
So let's look into SNCF. Yes, they have built a lot of high-speed rail in France. But if you go back in the history books, oh my, they were also involved in the World War II deportation of 76,000 innocent men, women, and children to Nazi concentration camps. At the very least, we should have government officials checking that we are not doing business with companies where the CEOs have stated that they were cogs in the Nazi extermination machine. Maybe there was a vice president at Alto who was tasked to do this and she just recused herself.
Growing up, this was a dream, high-speed rail. What we're saying to Canadians now is it can be real. We can give this gift to our children.
Never invite Minister MacKinnon to your birthday party because you'll probably get a gift you do not want, you cannot use, and that will put you and your children and your grandchildren into thousands of dollars of debt.
If we had started 30 years ago, we'd have it now. And it's something that Canadians probably should have demanded of their governments 30 years ago.
Talking smack about the government 30 years ago. And who was in charge 30 years ago? Oh, the Liberals under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Oh, that is not a good idea, Mr. MacKinnon. Chrétien is the only Prime Minister to have a finishing move named after him.
Would you give me a Shawinigan handshake?
Oh boy, you still got it.
I would sleep with one eye and one ear open. In fact, it's so devastating, it's almost like being hit by my third cousin Stephen during beach football, which looks a little something like this.
Disrespectful was that?
Look, this is a project that covers 40% of Canada's population. And by the way, that does not mean we stop there.
All right, so he says 40% of the Canadian population. But if you actually break down those numbers, there's only a small percentage of people that are actually going to be able to afford to buy tickets. If you're thinking this is something fun that you can bring your family on, it's estimated to be close to $3,500 for a round trip to get from Toronto to Montreal. So you're not going to do that. This is designed for a very small fraction, probably 10% or less of people that are living close to urban center cores and who are usually the business or political elite. This is not a project for all Canadians. And when he says we won't stop there, I'm asking you, please stop even before you get there. That would be wonderful.
I think high-speed rail is a technology that we have to contemplate for other regions of Canada as well. But we have to get this project, do it right.
Do it right. So this project is in the hands of companies that were involved in the LRT and other rail debacles over the last 20 years. That's kind of like going out for breakfast, ordering a piece of toast, and when you finally get it after waiting 45 minutes, it's completely burnt. And then saying, you know what? I think you should cater our wedding. This is a bad idea.
Consult, listen, be very, very sensitive. We need to explain the benefits. They are considerable for our environment. They are considerable for our economy.
So when Mr. MacKinnon is talking about benefits to the economy, he's not talking about the Canadian economy. He's talking about the financial status of the shareholders of the companies who are involved in this project.
Think of the trade union men and women who will build this, 51,000 people strong.
You know what would be even a better use of the expertise of tradespeople? Maybe building housing.
Think of the Canadian steel and lumber and aluminum that will go into building this project.
All right, I looked into this, and when the minister said, we'll be using lumber, I thought, wow, is this a brand new technology? There are currently 0 high-speed rail systems that actually use lumber. So again, if you're making mistakes with the little things, the big things will never pan out for you.
Will it be affordable for people who are using it?
Well, first of all, we will be maintaining via rail service,
Which is not cheap either.
We need to be very reassuring to folks.
So when he says we need to be reassuring, the takeaway from that is do not be reassured. It's kind of like when someone says, trust me, don't trust them.
About that, people who rely on via rail service will continue to enjoy via rail service. And the operating model of high-speed rail will be put out to tender. It will go to the lowest bidder. So,
having watched countless renovation shows, I can guarantee you that going with the lowest bidder is never the recipe for success.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Okay, some key takeaways from that interview. You should not be reassured. Continue to ask questions. The minister has an unhealthy obsession with the opposition and what they're thinking about. And finally, he should really watch out in dark alleys for Jean Chrétien because he just might get that Shawinigan handshake for disrespecting the former prime minister and his government 30 years ago. What can we do? Well, continue to spread the word, get the message out, put lawn signs up, let people know that this is a bad idea. It is going to cost our children thousands and thousands, and it really only benefits a very small portion of business and political elite, and really not even the most elite, because they are all flying in private jets anyway. It's kind of like the B team of elite. So why do this in the first place? This is an appeal to the Prime Minister. You know business, you know the economy. This is not a good investment. It doesn't address any of the economic or generational inequality that we have right now in this country. And it is being built by former Nazi collaborators. That should be enough to stop it right there. So be a leader, step up, cancel this project in its current form. If you're not going to do it for the Canadian people or their children, then at least do it for those fallen heroes who fought the Nazis to honor their sacrifices. Thanks.